There are certain objects we use so often that we hardly see them at all. They wait quietly in the background of our lives. A cup on a shelf, a key in a pocket, a pillow at the head of a bed, and, beside the bathroom sink, a toothbrush. It is usually one of the first objects we reach for in the morning, and one of the last we use at night. We lift it almost without thinking. We add a small line of toothpaste, run it under water, and begin the familiar movement across our teeth. A few minutes later, it is rinsed and returned to its cup, its holder, or its charger. The ritual is so ordinary that the toothbrush can seem almost timeless. Its shape feels obvious. A handle at one end. A small group of bristles at the other. It seems difficult to imagine that it could ever have looked very different. But the toothbrush has not always been a brightly colored piece of plastic. It has not always contained nylon. It has not always been made in a factory. And it has not always been a brush. Long before the modern bathroom existed, people were already searching for ways to clean their teeth. They used their fingers. They used cloth. They used powders made from the materials available around them. And in many parts of the world, they used small sticks taken from trees and shrubs. The end of a twig could be chewed until its fibers separated. Those fibers could then be moved across the teeth and gums, creating a small natural brush. In some places, this practice faded. In others, it survived. And in some communities, it remains part of daily life even now. The history of the toothbrush is therefore not the story of one sudden invention. Across the centuries, its materials and setting changed, but its basic purpose remained remarkably steady. There was no single morning when the world woke up and found the modern toothbrush waiting beside the sink. Instead, it developed slowly. It grew from different customs, different materials, and different understandings of the body. The toothbrush also belongs to the history of medicine. For much of human history, tooth care was not the organized profession we know today. A painful tooth might be treated by someone who also cut hair, performed small operations, or traveled from town to town offering extractions. Cleaning the teeth could be connected with appearance, pleasant breath, and social respectability as much as with preventing disease. Only gradually did brushing become part of a wider understanding of everyday health. The small brush beside the sink also belongs to the history of industry. The use of bone gave way to early plastics. Animal hair gave way to nylon. Handmade brushes became mass-produced products. Later, small electric motors were fitted inside the handle. Timers were added. Then pressure sensors. And eventually, some toothbrushes began to communicate with mobile phones, recording how long a person brushed and which parts of the mouth might have been missed. Yet beneath all this technology, the basic action has changed very little. A set of fibers is moved across the teeth. Material is disturbed and removed. The tool may contain a battery, a motor, or a computer chip, but the purpose would still be recognizable to someone using a softened twig centuries ago. Tonight, we will follow this quiet history. From natural sticks and animal bristles to plastic, electric motors, and more sustainable designs, we will follow the toothbrush as it slowly became part of everyday life. It is a long journey for such a small object. A journey through trees and workshops, bathrooms and factories, medicine and habit. And it begins thousands of years before the toothbrush looked anything like the one we know today. Long before there were toothbrushes, people still noticed the condition of their teeth. They knew when something was caught between them. They knew when the mouth felt unclean. They knew the discomfort of a sore gum, a broken tooth, or a pain that would not go away. What they did not have was the small manufactured brush that now seems so ordinary. There were no nylon bristles. No plastic handles. No tubes of toothpaste waiting beside a basin. Instead, people used the materials that were close at hand. A finger could be wrapped in a piece of cloth and rubbed across the teeth. A small amount of water might be used. Sometimes a powder or other rough substance was added to help remove staining or debris. A narrow object could be used to dislodge food from between the teeth. And in many places, people discovered that a simple stick could become a surprisingly effective cleaning tool. The stick was usually small enough to hold comfortably in one hand. One end was placed in the mouth and gently chewed. As the wood softened, its fibers began to separate. The smooth end of the twig slowly became something more like a brush. The fibers could then be rubbed across the teeth and around the gums. The idea was simple. A material that began as part of a tree or shrub could be transformed, with no machinery at all, into a personal cleaning tool. Different communities used different plants. The choice depended partly on what grew nearby. A useful stick needed to be strong enough to hold its shape, but soft enough to form fibers when chewed. Some plants also had a distinctive taste or scent. Others may have been valued because experience suggested that they left the mouth feeling especially clean. The exact beginnings of this practice are difficult to trace. Wood and plant fibers decay. A small cleaning stick used centuries ago was unlikely to survive in the ground in the way that pottery, metal, or stone might survive. This means that the earliest history of tooth cleaning cannot always be reconstructed from complete objects. Instead, it has to be pieced together from surviving texts, images, traditions, and occasional archaeological evidence. What is clear is that tooth cleaning sticks were used in more than one part of the ancient world. They are associated with communities across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Similar practices appeared in different places, using different local plants. This suggests something important about the history of the toothbrush. It did not begin with one inventor. It did not begin in one workshop. And it did not begin with a carefully designed handle carrying rows of bristles. It began with a much more basic observation. If the surface of the teeth was rubbed with something fibrous, some of the material gathered there could be removed. That understanding could be reached without formal dentistry. It could be learned through habit and passed from one generation to the next. A child might watch an adult prepare a stick. A traveler might encounter a new plant or a different cleaning method. A local custom might become part of an everyday routine. Some methods were effective, while others could be harsh. All depended on the material and the care with which it was used. The modern toothbrush often appears to be an object with a clear beginning. It is tempting to imagine that someone invented it fully formed, and that everything before it was merely preparation. But the reality is quieter and more complicated. For centuries, people cleaned their teeth without a brush. Then they used objects that behaved like brushes without being manufactured as brushes. The chewed end of a twig was already performing the basic task that toothbrush bristles perform today. It disturbed material on the tooth surface. It reached along the gums. It combined a handle and a cleaning end in one simple object. It was portable, replaceable, and made directly from the landscape around its user. In that sense, the earliest toothbrush may not have looked like a toothbrush at all. It may have looked like nothing more than a small piece of wood. Easy to find, easy to carry, and easy to replace when its fibers became worn. The story of the toothbrush therefore begins not with invention, but with adaptation. A plant becomes a tool. A repeated action becomes a habit. And a habit, carried quietly across generations, becomes part of the long human effort to care for the body. In the next part of that history, one particular kind of tooth cleaning stick would become especially important. It would be known as the miswak. And unlike many ancient tools, it would not disappear into the past. Among the many plants used to clean the teeth, one became especially well known. It is called the miswak. The same object may also be described as a sawak. At first glance, it appears very simple. A narrow stick, light enough to carry, small enough to fit easily in the hand. Yet within that small piece of plant material are the three basic parts of a toothbrush: a handle, a set of fibers, and a surface used to clean the teeth and gums. Miswak is most commonly associated with the Salvadora persica plant. It is sometimes called the Iraq tree. It is also known, quite appropriately, as the toothbrush tree. The plant grows in parts of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Its roots, twigs, and branches can be cut into small sticks. One end is then prepared by chewing or softening it until the fibers begin to separate. As the end opens, it becomes brush-like. The fibers can be moved over the teeth. They can be guided around the gum line. They can reach into some of the small spaces where food and plaque collect. The movement is familiar, even if the object is not. The hand turns the stick. The fibers pass over the tooth surface. The mouth is cleaned through repetition. This basic action links the miswak directly to the modern toothbrush. But the miswak is more than an early version of something that came later. It has its own long and continuing history. In many communities, it did not vanish when factory-made toothbrushes became available. It remained useful. It remained portable. And it remained connected with customs that gave tooth cleaning a wider meaning. The use of the miswak became particularly important in Islamic traditions. Cleanliness holds an important place in religious and everyday life. The use of the siwak was encouraged as part of personal care, especially before prayer and at other moments during the day. This helped make tooth cleaning more than an occasional response to discomfort. It could become a regular practice. A small ritual repeated at familiar times. The stick might be used after waking, before worship, before entering the home, or whenever the mouth no longer felt fresh. The precise customs varied, but the central idea remained the same. Cleanliness was something to be maintained. The miswak therefore belongs to the history of hygiene, but also to the history of routine. It shows how a repeated action can become deeply rooted when it is supported by tradition. A modern toothbrush often waits in one place. It sits beside the sink until morning or evening. A miswak can travel much more easily. It needs no charger, no cup, no tube of toothpaste, no running water before it can be used. It can be carried in a pocket or a small container. It can be prepared again when the fibers become worn by cutting back the end and exposing a fresh section. This made it particularly practical for travel and for daily life beyond the home. Its usefulness also came from the plant itself. The fibers provided the mechanical cleaning action. As they moved across the teeth, they disturbed plaque and loosened debris. This is the same basic principle used by every toothbrush. But Solvadora persica also contains naturally occurring chemical compounds. Researchers have studied these compounds to understand whether they contribute to oral health. Some have been investigated for possible antimicrobial effects. Others may influence the environment of the mouth in different ways. This does not mean that simply holding a miswak guarantees healthy teeth. Like any cleaning tool, it depends on how it is used. A person can brush carefully or carelessly. Some surfaces can be reached repeatedly while others are missed. Too much pressure can irritate the gums. Too little attention can leave areas uncleaned. Studies suggest that a properly used miswak can help control plaque and gum inflammation, although technique remains essential. Technique matters. Frequency matters. And the condition of the fibers matters. The safest conclusion is also the most useful one. The miswak can be an effective oral cleaning tool when it is prepared and used correctly. It should not be dismissed as an outdated practice. Nor should it be presented as a magical object that works without care or technique. Its survival into the present day tells us something important. Technological change does not always erase older tools. Sometimes an object remains because it continues to suit the people using it. The miswak is inexpensive. It is portable. It is made from a renewable plant material. And it carries cultural and religious meaning that a mass-produced plastic brush may not carry. For some people, it is a practical tool. For others, it is part of faith. For many, it is both. Older and newer cleaning methods did not simply replace one another. They often continued side by side. In homes, places of worship and journeys across the world, people still prepare the end of a small stick and use its fibers to clean their teeth. The action connects the present with practices that are centuries old. It also reminds us that an object does not need to become complicated in order to remain useful. A twig can still be a tool. A plant can still become a brush. And a method shaped by ancient habit can continue quietly in the modern world. The miswak did not need to become a museum object. It remained part of daily life. Meanwhile, elsewhere, another form of tooth cleaning tool was developing. Instead of creating fibers by chewing the end of a plant, makers began attaching bristles to a separate handle. This change would produce an object much closer to the toothbrush we recognize today. And much of that next stage of the story would take place in China. For centuries, the simplest toothbrush was not really a brush at all. It was a stick whose fibers were created by chewing. But at some point, another idea began to take shape. Instead of making a brush from the end of a plant, people began attaching bristles to a separate handle. This was a small change in construction, but it created an object much closer to the toothbrush we recognize today. The earliest recognizable handled bristle toothbrushes are strongly associated with China. Their exact beginnings are difficult to date. Some accounts place them earlier. Others point to later written descriptions. One Chinese source from the late 15th century described a brush with bristles fixed at right angles to a handle. That basic arrangement is immediately familiar. A narrow handle, a small head, and a group of bristles projecting from one end. The materials, however, were very different from those used today. Handles could be made from bamboo, wood, or bone. Small holes were drilled into the head. Animal hairs were then gathered into tufts and fixed in place. Pig and boar hair became common choices. These bristles were not soft, smooth, or uniform. They varied naturally in thickness and shape. Some were coarse. Some were stiff. Some absorbed moisture and held it. A brush made from them could feel much harsher than the soft nylon brushes now found in shops and bathrooms. Yet the structure was remarkably modern. The bristles were no longer part of the handle itself. They could be arranged deliberately. They could be placed in rows or small groups. The shape of the brush head could be controlled, and the brush could be made as a separate manufactured object. This was an important step. The tooth cleaning stick had grown directly from a plant. The bristle brush had to be designed and assembled. Someone needed to choose the handle material. Someone needed to shape it. Someone needed to drill the holes. And someone needed to gather and attach the hairs. The brush was therefore no longer only a natural object adapted for use. It had become a crafted tool. Its manufacture required knowledge, materials, and labor. It also reflected the resources available to the maker. Bamboo was light and practical. Wood could be cut and shaped. Bone was harder and more durable. Animal hair provided the cleaning surface. Each material contributed a different quality to the finished brush. The result was still simple, but it was no longer accidental. Its form had been planned. The bristles had been placed where they would be most useful. The handle had been shaped so that it could be held comfortably. The object had begun to acquire a recognizable design. Its beginnings cannot be fixed to one certain year, but the handled bristle brush developed in China over time. Nor did it immediately replace every older way of cleaning the teeth. Chewing sticks continued to be used. Cloths were still used. Toothpicks and powders remained common. The arrival of the bristle brush simply added another method. For many people, the older tools were easier to obtain. A twig could be cut locally. A cloth was already present in the home. A manufactured brush required materials, tools, and someone with the skill to assemble it. This made the early bristle brush a more specialized object. It may have been valued for convenience. It may have been valued for status. And because it could be made from durable materials, it could last longer than a simple stick. It was also beginning to travel. Knowledge of bristle brushes appears to have moved gradually westward through trade, travel, and cultural exchange. Adoption was slow, and cloths, powders, toothpicks, and chewing sticks remained common. In parts of Europe, people continued to rely on cloths, powders, and toothpicks for a long time. Even when bristle brushes became known, they remained uncommon for many people. The materials alone could make them costly. Bone or ivory had to be cut and drilled. Animal hair had to be cleaned, sorted, and fixed into place. The finished object might therefore be treated as a personal possession rather than something casually replaced. It could be stored carefully, carried in a case, and valued for both usefulness and appearance. But beneath the decoration, its purpose remained practical. The bristles were moved across the teeth. The head was small enough to enter the mouth. The handle gave the user control. The same three-part arrangement survives today. Handle, head, bristles. The materials have changed. The methods of manufacture have changed. The scale of production has changed. But the basic form remains. The Chinese bristle brush marks one of the clearest points at which the long history of tooth cleaning begins to resemble the object beside the modern sink. It is not yet the toothbrush most people would recognize. Its bristles are animal hair. Its handle may be bamboo or bone. It may be handmade and expensive. But its shape is unmistakable. And once that shape existed, it could be copied, adapted, and manufactured in many different ways. As the brush traveled westward, it entered societies where tooth cleaning still depended heavily on cloths, powders, and improvised tools. There, it would become part of a much wider and often uncomfortable history of dental care. A history of whitening powders, painful teeth, traveling tooth pullers, and brushes that were still far from ordinary. As the Bristle toothbrush became known beyond China, it entered a world where tooth cleaning was still varied, improvised, and often uncomfortable. For many people, a brush was not the main tool used to clean the mouth. A piece of cloth could be wrapped around a finger and rubbed across the teeth. A toothpick could remove food trapped in a small gap. A powder could be applied to polish the surface. These methods were simple, but they were not always gentle. Some powders contained abrasive substances such as chalk, charcoal, or salt. They could help remove visible staining. They could leave the teeth feeling smoother. They could also wear at the surface if they were too coarse or used too firmly. This distinction between cleaning and caring for the teeth was not always clearly understood. A tooth might look whiter while becoming more vulnerable. A rough powder might create the sensation of cleanliness while slowly damaging the enamel. People often judged oral care by what they could see, taste, or smell. White teeth suggested health and refinement. Fresh breath suggested cleanliness. A polished smile could become part of social appearance. For this reason, tooth cleaning preparations were often concerned as much with beauty and respectability as with preventing disease. The modern idea of brushing to control plaque developed gradually. Earlier users may not have understood the invisible film that gathers on the teeth in the way dentists understand it today. They knew, however, that the mouth could feel unpleasant. They knew that food became trapped. They knew that teeth could darken. And they knew that dental pain could become severe. For much of history, the treatment available for a painful tooth was limited. There were no modern local anesthetics. No X-rays. No reliable antibiotics. No quiet, brightly lit surgery designed around careful preservation of the tooth. When pain became unbearable, removal was often the practical solution. In medieval and early modern Europe, teeth were sometimes extracted by barber surgeons. These practitioners did more than cut hair and shave beards. They might also perform bloodletting, dress wounds, and carry out simple surgical procedures. Tooth extraction belonged to this mixture of trades. The experience could be public. A traveling tooth puller might perform before a crowd. Speed and confidence mattered. Pain relief was uncertain, and the main aim was often not to repair the tooth, but simply to remove the source of suffering. This made prevention especially important, even when the reasons behind tooth decay were not fully understood. A person who cleaned their teeth regularly might be motivated by appearance, comfort, or habit. They might be trying to avoid bad breath. They might hope to delay the pain associated with damaged teeth. But regular tooth cleaning was not yet universal. It depended on knowledge, custom, and access to suitable tools. A manufactured brush still required skilled work and could remain an expensive personal possession. The finished brush might therefore be treated as a valued personal possession. It was not necessarily bought casually. It was not replaced every few months. It might be kept for years. Some brushes were made to look elegant. Handles could be carved or polished. The material itself could suggest wealth. Ivory, in particular, could turn an ordinary cleaning tool into an object of status. A brush might sit alongside combs, mirrors, and other personal items used for grooming. It belonged to the wider world of appearance and self-presentation. Some brushes were designed for travel. They could fold into a handle or fit inside a protective case. This helped keep the bristles from being crushed or soiled. It also reflected the fact that a brush might be taken on a journey rather than left permanently beside a wash basin. The modern bathroom had not yet become a standard room in every home. Washing and grooming could take place in bedrooms, dressing rooms, or beside a basin carried in by hand. Water had to be fetched. A jug and bowl might serve in place of a fixed sink. Personal objects were stored in boxes, drawers, and traveling cases. The toothbrush belonged to this portable world of domestic life. It was small enough to move, private enough to belong to one person, and useful enough to be kept carefully. The toothbrush was slowly moving towards ordinary domestic life. But it still carried traces of luxury. Its materials could be expensive. Its bristles could be harsh. Its manufacture could be slow. And its use could sit somewhere between health, beauty, and social display. The wider world of dentistry was changing as well. Knowledge was becoming more organized. Dental practice was gradually becoming more specialized. Printed advice about hygiene became easier to circulate. Manufacturers found new ways to package and promote their products. But before the toothbrush could become truly ordinary, it needed to become easier to produce. It needed to move from the workbench into the factory. It needed to be made in greater numbers. And in Britain, one of the best-known stories of that transition would become attached to a prisoner, a small piece of bone and a handful of bristles. In the history of the British toothbrush, one name appears more often than any other: William Addis. His story has been repeated for generations. According to the traditional account, Addis was imprisoned in Newgate Prison during the 1770s. While there, he is said to have become dissatisfied with the way people cleaned their teeth using a rag. A cloth could be wrapped around a finger. It could be rubbed across the teeth. But Addis apparently believed that something more effective was possible. The story says that he saved a small piece of animal bone from a meal. He shaped it into a handle. He drilled a series of holes into one end. Then he obtained a small number of bristles and fixed them into place. The result was a handmade brush. A bone handle, animal hair, and a shape that would have looked immediately familiar to a modern user. It is a memorable story. A useful object created in confinement. A simple idea formed from scraps. A prisoner making the beginnings of a future business. But it should be treated carefully. The details are part of the traditional history of the Addis Company. They are often repeated. Yet they are difficult to prove in the same way as a surviving factory record or dated patent. William Addis also did not invent the world's first toothbrush. Handled bristle brushes had been used in China long before his lifetime. His importance lies elsewhere. He helped turn the toothbrush into a manufactured British product. After leaving prison, Addis established a business making brushes. The basic construction was still labor-intensive. Handles were made from bone, and in some cases ivory. The material had to be cleaned, then cut, then shaped and polished. Small holes had to be made in the brush head. The bristles were prepared separately. Animal hair was gathered, sorted and fixed into the handle in small tufts. Each stage required skill. The finished brush may have looked simple, but many hands and processes lay behind it. Bone handles were cleaned, cut, shaped, polished and drilled before bristle tufts could be secured. The bristles were also part of an international trade. Natural hair arrived from several regions and had to be sorted and prepared before use. The Addis Company used natural hair brought from different regions, including parts of Europe, Russia, and China. The brush itself was personal. Its production was increasingly industrial. The Addis business continued after William's death. Successive generations of the family expanded it. The company became closely associated with Hertford. There, toothbrush manufacture became part of the town's industrial life. Workers produced brushes in growing numbers. Machinery gradually took over some of the stages that had once been completed entirely by hand. Handles could be made more consistently. Holes could be placed more accurately. Production could become quicker. Machines improved consistency, while skilled workers still handled and inspected the materials. This was an important transition. The toothbrush was moving away from being an unusual object made in small quantities. It was becoming something that could be produced repeatedly. One brush could be made to resemble the next. A particular model could have the same length, shape, and arrangement of bristles each time. Consistency made selling easier. Manufacturers could offer brushes for ordinary use, travel, children, or more affluent customers. Customers could begin to know what they were buying. The rise of manufacturing also began to change its price. A handmade brush required time and specialist labor. A factory-made brush could be produced in much greater quantities. As production increased, brushes could gradually reach a wider public. They were still not yet the cheap, replaceable objects of the 20th century. Bone and natural bristles remained costly. The brush still had to be cared for. But the direction of travel was clear. A private grooming tool was becoming a mass-produced household product. The toothbrush was leaving the dressing case of the wealthy and moving slowly towards the ordinary washstand. Today, Hertford Museum preserves an important collection connected with the Addis Company. It includes toothbrushes, photographs, documents, and manufacturing equipment. These objects reveal how much work once went into something that is now purchased casually. A modern toothbrush can be lifted from a supermarket shelf without much thought. Its handle is smooth. Its bristles are even. Its price is usually modest. But the earlier bone brush carried visible traces of its materials and its maker. The handle came from an animal. The bristles came from another. The holes were drilled. The tufts were fixed. The final object had passed through a sequence of hands. William Addis did not create the toothbrush from nothing. The idea was far older than he was. But the business associated with his name helped make the brush a recognizable part of British manufacturing. It helped move the toothbrush from craft to industry. And once the brush could be made in greater numbers, another transformation became possible. It could become normal. Not a luxury. Not a curiosity. Not an object kept only in a traveling case. But something expected in the home. Something taught to children. Something used every morning and every night. The next stage in the story is therefore not only about materials or machinery. It is about habit. How the toothbrush left the factory and entered the bathroom. How manufacturers learned to package and advertise it. And how a private grooming tool became an ordinary part of everyday health. By the 19th century, the toothbrush was no longer quite as unusual as it had once been. Factories could produce brushes in larger numbers. Handles could be shaped more consistently. Bristles could be arranged in repeated patterns. And manufacturers could begin offering different models to different customers. But greater availability did not immediately make toothbrushing a universal habit. Owning a brush was one thing. Using it regularly was another. For many people, daily brushing had not yet become automatic. A brush might be used occasionally. It might be used before a social event. It might be used when the mouth felt unpleasant. It might be kept as part of a grooming set, alongside a comb, mirror, or shaving tool. The idea of brushing at fixed times every day developed gradually. This change depended on more than the toothbrush itself. It depended on changes in the home, changes in education, changes in public health, and changes in what people expected of their own bodies. The toothbrush needed a place in everyday life. The spread of indoor plumbing and fixed bathroom sinks gradually gave it a permanent place beside the basin. Manufacturers helped encourage this change. As more companies entered the market, toothbrushes were given brand names and model names. Different shapes and sizes were advertised. Some were presented as elegant, some as scientific, some as practical. Some were designed especially for travel. Others were packaged to suggest cleanliness and modernity. Packaging protected the brush, carried instructions, and helped present it as a clean, modern product. Advertising helped turn oral care into a social expectation. Clean teeth and fresh breath became associated with confidence, respectability, and self-discipline. A clean mouth became connected with self-discipline. Fresh breath became connected with confidence. Well-kept teeth became part of respectable appearance. The message was often subtle. A person who brushed was not simply removing debris. They were presenting themselves properly to the world. At the same time, dentistry was becoming more organized. Dental knowledge was moving towards a distinct profession. Training became more formal. Specialist practices became more common. Advice about caring for the teeth began to circulate more widely. Printed materials could explain why regular cleaning mattered. Schools and public institutions could teach children about hygiene. The toothbrush gained authority from this association. It was no longer simply a grooming accessory. It was becoming a tool recommended by professionals. This was a significant shift. Earlier tooth cleaning had often focused on visible stains, unpleasant taste, or breath. Now brushing could be presented as prevention. The aim was not only to make the mouth feel clean. It was to reduce the conditions that contributed to decay and gum disease. The toothbrush became part of a larger public health message. Small preventive actions were to be repeated before pain appeared. Care for the body before pain appears. Repeat small actions regularly. Prevent problems rather than waiting to treat them. Children were especially important to this change. A habit learned early could continue for life. Schools, families, and health campaigns could all reinforce the same message. Use a brush. Clean every part of the mouth. Repeat the routine each day. The exact advice changed over time, but the broader goal remained consistent. Make brushing ordinary. Still, the spread of brushing was uneven. Cost remained a barrier for some families. Access to dental care varied. Indoor plumbing was not universal. Health advice did not reach every community at the same time. And even when people knew that brushing was recommended, daily life could make the routine difficult. There was no single moment when everyone began brushing. The habit spread gradually, household by household and generation by generation. The change happened gradually. Household by household. School by school. Generation by generation. Over time, the toothbrush became so familiar that its earlier status was almost forgotten. It had once been carved from bone. It had once been expensive. It had once been carried in a protective case as a valued possession. Now it could be purchased in ordinary shops. It could be provided to children. It could be replaced when worn. It could wait openly beside the sink. The object had moved from luxury to necessity. And with that change came a new expectation. A toothbrush should not only exist. It should be used regularly. This was the moment when the history of the brush became inseparable from the history of the bathroom. The room, the routine, and the object reinforced one another. The bathroom gave the toothbrush a home. The toothbrush gave the bathroom one of its most familiar rituals. And the daily ritual helped make preventive health feel ordinary. But the brush itself was still made from materials with serious limitations. Bone and ivory were difficult to shape and supply. Animal bristles were uneven. They absorbed moisture. They could remain damp. They could be difficult to clean. For the toothbrush to become truly modern, its materials would have to change. The next great transformation would come from the chemical industries of the 20th century. Bone would give way to plastic. Animal hair would give way to nylon. And the toothbrush would begin to look almost exactly as it does today. By the beginning of the 20th century, the toothbrush had found its place in the home. It had become easier to buy. More people were being encouraged to use it regularly. And brushing was beginning to feel like a normal part of personal hygiene. But the brush itself still carried the materials of an earlier age. Many handles were made from bone. Some were made from ivory. The bristles came from animals. Bone, ivory, and natural hair had made early mass production possible, but they were costly, uneven, and difficult to keep dry. That change would come from the growth of the plastics and chemical industries. Early plastics offered manufacturers something they had never possessed before. A material that could be shaped repeatedly. A material that could be produced in color. A material that did not depend on carving bone or ivory. By the 1930s, toothbrush handles were increasingly being made from substances such as celluloid and bakelite. These early plastics could be molded or shaped into consistent forms. A manufacturer could produce thousands of handles that looked almost identical. The grip could be made smoother. The head could be made narrower. The handle could be colored. The finished brush could be lighter and easier to package. Plastic made the brush lighter, more consistent, and recognizably modern. The greatest transformation, however, took place in the bristles. For centuries, brush makers had relied on animal hair. Pig and boar bristles had been widely used because they were stiff enough to provide a cleaning surface. But natural bristles had clear weaknesses. They were not uniform. They absorbed water. They could remain damp between uses. And because each hair was naturally formed, manufacturers had only limited control over its thickness, texture, and shape. A synthetic alternative promised greater consistency. During the 1930s, nylon was developed. It was one of a new generation of man-made materials that seemed to represent the future. It could be drawn into filaments. Those filaments could be manufactured to a controlled length and thickness. They did not need to be taken from animals, and they could be produced in enormous quantities. In 1938, the Drive West's brand introduced a toothbrush with nylon bristles. This was one of the clearest turning points in the history of the object. The brush still had a handle, a head and rows of fibers. But the fibers were no longer natural hair. They had been designed and manufactured. This gave brush makers a new level of control. The bristles could be made more uniform. Their stiffness could be adjusted. Their arrangement could be repeated from one brush to the next. Production became more predictable. The toothbrush became easier to standardize. Nylon was also promoted as more hygienic. Unlike natural animal hair, synthetic filaments did not absorb moisture in the same way. They dried more readily. They appeared cleaner and more modern. Nylon suited an age increasingly concerned with sanitation and technical progress. Yet the earliest nylon bristles were not necessarily gentle. Some were quite stiff. A synthetic material could be more consistent without being softer. Users could still brush too hard. Gums could still be irritated. The tooth surface could still be worn by aggressive brushing. Over time, manufacturers began producing finer and more flexible filaments. Brushes were labeled according to firmness: hard, medium, soft. The language suggested that users now had a choice. But dental advice gradually moved towards gentler brushing. The aim was not to scrub the teeth with as much force as possible. It was to disturb plaque carefully and repeatedly. A softer bristle could clean effectively while reducing unnecessary damage. Handles changed as well. Plastic allowed designers to experiment with shape. A handle could curve. It could widen where the fingers rested. It could include a textured grip. Later, softer rubber-like materials could be added to the harder plastic body. The toothbrush became more comfortable to hold. Color, grip shapes, and smaller children's models made brushes easier to distinguish and use. By the middle of the 20th century, the modern manual toothbrush had largely taken shape. A molded plastic handle. A compact head. Rows of nylon filaments. A form light enough to manufacture, transport, and sell in great numbers. The change was so successful that it became almost invisible. Bone handles disappeared from daily life. Animal hair became unusual. The plastic and nylon brush came to seem natural, even though both materials were entirely products of modern industry. The toothbrush was now cheap enough to be replaced regularly. Worn, splayed bristles became a signal that the brush should be replaced. Yet despite the different shapes and claims, the central principle remained unchanged. A relatively small brush head needs to reach every surface. The bristles need to move gently along the teeth and gums. The user needs to repeat the process regularly. No color or handle shape can replace careful technique. No complex bristle pattern can clean an area the user never reaches. The toothbrush had become modern, but it had not become automatic. It still depended on the hand holding it. That limitation created the next opportunity for invention. If the movement of the brush was important, perhaps a motor could provide it. Perhaps the handle could do more than simply guide the bristles. It could rotate them, vibrate them, time the brushing, and eventually, even warn the user when too much pressure was being applied. The plastic and nylon toothbrush had completed one transformation. The next would begin when electricity entered the handle. By the middle of the 20th century, the toothbrush had become modern in almost every visible way. Its handle was made from plastic. Its bristles were made from nylon. Its shape was light, colorful, and easy to manufacture. But one part of the object had not changed. The movement still came entirely from the person holding it. The hand guided the brush. The wrist created the motion. The user decided how long to continue, how firmly to press, and which areas of the mouth to reach. The next stage in the toothbrush's history began when inventors placed a motor inside the handle. Commercial electric toothbrushes appeared during the middle of the 20th century. One of the earliest successful examples was the Bristles, developed in Switzerland during the 1950s. It was designed to move the brush head automatically. The user still had to guide it around the mouth, but the repeated brushing motion no longer depended entirely on the hand. This made the powered brush particularly useful for people who found manual brushing difficult. Someone with limited movement in the hands or wrists could receive help from the motor. People wearing orthodontic appliances could also benefit from a brush capable of providing steady, repeated movement around more complicated surfaces. Early electric toothbrushes were not as convenient as the cordless models found in bathrooms today. Some were connected directly to an electrical supply. Their size and design reflected the technology of the period. They were appliances rather than small personal gadgets. The motor, cable, and brush head formed a system that needed a fixed place. Over time, batteries changed this. Rechargeable models could be lifted from a base and used without a cable. The handle became easier to hold. The motor became smaller. The brush could travel. And the electric toothbrush moved from specialist use into the ordinary consumer market. Brush heads were developed with rotating, oscillating, and rapidly vibrating movements, all intended to move bristles repeatedly across the teeth. The motor does not remove the need for technique. The user must still guide the head around every tooth and along the gum line. This is why later toothbrushes began to include more than motors. They began to include feedback. One of the simplest additions was a timer. Timers encourage sufficient brushing time and can divide the mouth into shorter sections. Pressure sensors serve a similar purpose. They can warn the user when the brush is being pressed too firmly. Brushing harder does not necessarily mean brushing better. Too much force can irritate the gums and contribute to wear. This creates an unusual contrast. The toothbrush remains one of the simplest household tools. Its function can be understood at a glance. Yet inside the handle there may now be a battery, motor, sensor, circuit board, and wireless connection. The object has become technically complicated while the basic action remains ancient. Fibers still pass across teeth. The gum line still requires care. The user still stands beside water and repeats a familiar ritual. Technology has changed the assistance around the action, but not the action itself. The modern toothbrush has also created a different problem. For much of history, a tooth cleaning stick came directly from a plant. A bone brush combined natural materials that could be shaped and repaired. The 20th century brush was cheaper, cleaner, and easier to produce. But it also became disposable. A modern brush combines several tightly joined materials, which can make ordinary recycling difficult. This has encouraged designers and manufacturers to reconsider the object once again. Some brushes now use handles made from bamboo or wood. These designs recall the earliest relationship between tooth cleaning and plant material. But the environmental picture is not always simple. A bamboo handle may break down more easily than a plastic one. Its bristles may still be nylon. The material securing the tufts may still be synthetic. Packaging, transport, and manufacturing also contribute to the total impact. No single material automatically creates a perfect toothbrush. Replaceable head designs reduce waste by retaining the handle and discarding only the worn part. But there is also a limit to how much complexity the object needs. A toothbrush does not become effective simply because it is connected to a phone. It still needs to reach the teeth. Its bristles must still be in good condition. It must still be used gently and regularly. The most advanced brush can still fail if it remains on its charger. And the simplest brush can still work well in careful hands. Through every change in material and technology, the essential task remains the same: moving fibers gently across the teeth and gums. And so, after thousands of years, the toothbrush returns us to a very small moment. A quiet bathroom. A little water. A hand reaching towards the sink. The object waiting there may be made from plastic, bamboo, or metal. It may contain a battery. It may vibrate, flash, or count the seconds. Or it may be nothing more than a simple manual brush. But its purpose remains familiar: to move fibers across the teeth. To clean what cannot be left unattended. to repeat a small act of care. The toothbrush has traveled a long way to arrive beside the modern sink. It began with fingers, cloths, and narrow sticks. It took shape in the fibers of plants. It became a crafted brush in China. It passed through workshops where bone was cut, drilled, and polished. It entered factories. It was packaged, advertised, and carried into homes. Animal hair gave way to nylon. Bone gave way to plastic. The hand was joined by electricity, and the brush became capable of measuring time, pressure, and habit. Yet the most important part of the story was never the material. It was the routine. A toothbrush has value only when it is used. Its history is therefore also the history of repetition. Morning after morning, evening after evening, one generation teaching the next. A parent guiding a child's hand. A traveler packing a brush into a small bag. A person standing half awake before the mirror. The action is ordinary because it has been repeated so many times. And because it is ordinary, it is easy to overlook. But hidden within those few quiet minutes are centuries of experiment, trade, craft, science, and changing ideas about health. The brush beside the sink contains all of these ideas, even when we do not notice them. Its changing materials reflect changing ideas about cleanliness, convenience, technology, and sustainability. Perhaps that is true of many everyday objects. Their histories disappear because their use becomes effortless. Once something fits naturally into daily life, we stop asking how it arrived there. We simply reach for it, use it, rinse it, and place it back where it waits. Tomorrow morning, the toothbrush will still be there. Quiet, familiar, almost invisible. But now, perhaps, it may seem a little less ordinary. A simple object shaped by centuries of human care, from the first softened twig to the modern brush beside the sink. A little older, and a little stranger.